Let's get started. So the last time that we did a video lecture, I had asked you guys to take a look at my introduction to adolescence in the United States and how this period of adolescence between childhood and adulthood is, relatively speaking, a new development in human society, right? And it's kind of the product of a bunch of things. We talked about education, the workforce, some of the kind of changing social norms. And as a result, the development of this middle ground between childhood and adulthood that we now call adolescence. So today we're going to move forward, and we're going to start looking at adulthood in the United States, which is also something that has changed dramatically in really the last half a century. So we're going to introduce some of the key terms and concepts, things to kind of pay attention to, and start to get into a little more depth about what it means to be an adult in a sociological sense. So I like to start with this. What this is the median age of Americans in 2013 by state. And you see that, roughly speaking, the average age is somewhere in the 35 to 37 range if you look across the United States. But you see some differences. We see that on the East Coast, Americans tend to be older on average. On the West Coast and in the South, Americans generally tend to be younger. Utah is the youngest state in the United States. And then you see certain states like Florida and West Virginia and Vermont and New Hampshire being on the older end. And a lot of this has to do with kind of changing nature of where people live and why they go to certain places. A lot of American families have moved to the West and to the South because it's a little cheaper to live. And that then lowers the median age because people start to have more children. A lot of colleges are based in the West and in the South now. And a lot of people choose to then stay there. So that tends to lower the ages a little bit. But there's other factors too. And these are all the things that we're going to start to get into today. So in the United States, when we look at adulthood in a sociological sense, we can divide it into three categories. Early adulthood, which is generally seen as being roughly your 17th birthday until you are 39. Middle adulthood, which is kind of like 40 to about 59. And then late adulthood, which is seen as 60. In addition to changing marital patterns, we also see changing family patterns in terms of when people have children. Not just in terms of age, but also kind of like life stages and life situations. So we got a lot of info on this graph here. You see that the bar chart is the percent of first births unmarried. So that's the percentage of children who are the firstborn child to a person prior to that person being married, or if that person just chooses to not be married permanently. And you see that number has gone up significantly, where there's kind of a misconception in the United States that, at one point in time, everybody was having children only after marriage. And that's not really true. So you see in 1970, about 1 out of every 5 children in the United States that was the first child born to a person. About 1 out of every 5 were born prior to or not into a married couple. And today that number has gone up to roughly 1 out of every 2, a little bit less. But what we also see is a change in age. So obviously the age of first birth has gone up, where women in the United States in 1970, on average, had their first child when they were 22. And today, on average, that number is about 26. But what we also see is that a lot of people are having their first child prior to their first marriage. And so again, what this starts to do is this starts to show that there is a shift in what are considered like the common kind of family structures. And more marriage and childhood or childbirth are not going to be directly linked to one another. They're obviously still a major component. I mean, you see, if you look at the chart, they're not that far apart, but it still is starting to signify that having a child and getting married are not necessarily things that go hand in hand in American culture anymore. So what we also start to see, wait, sorry. Um, what we also start to see is there's a major change in living situations too for people. Um, so when we look at millennials, all right, which are basically people in their 20s right now, give or take, and maybe like very, very early 30s. So when we look at the kind of next generation basically coming up in adulthood, the youngest of the adults in society, there's also a pretty significant change now in terms of their living situations after school. All right. So you see, in 1880, about 30% of people living in their 20s. All right. Obviously, millennials weren't around in 1880. About 30% were living with their parents still. And this is kind of a traditional gender norm thing. It was almost unheard of for women in particular to move out of their home prior to being married. You see that in addition to this, a little under half of people in their 20s basically were already married in 1880. And then the real big shifts are living alone, single parents, and other heads of household, that red bar, basically people who moved out of their parents' home but are not married. In 1880, there was almost no one. And then by 1940, we see that this skyrockets to about 30 to 35%. And then it crashes again in 1960, and now it's on the rise again by 2014. And then with green, other living arrangements. The most common in here is like roommates. All right, a lot of people will room with a person or two who they're obviously either not married to or in a relationship with. And you see that as we work our way towards the modern era, the big shifts are that people in their 20s are married far less frequently. That number has been cut in half from over 60% to just over 30%. And also people living out on their own or living with roommates or other types of situations have gone up dramatically. But the biggest change, obviously, in the last 100 to 150 years is the shift in marriage patterns. Now, when we look here at another graph, the number of young adults living at home is the highest it's been in 75 years. We see that, right after World War II, you see at 1950, there's this crash. That's all like the returning vets, right? A lot of people had a lot of money because they had saved it up during the war. They weren't really able to buy anything. Home prices were very, very cheap after the war too, so it was easy to buy a home. So young adults started to move out very rapidly for a short period of time. But then that number has risen up, and a lot of this has to do with costs, where now, young adults, 18 to 34-year-olds, about 40% of them are living at home today. And what we see is that a lot of this has to do with some of the impacts of costs, and we've talked a little bit about this before. So in the past, the average first-time home buyer was in their 20s. We are now in the point where most people are now in their 30s before they buy a home. You see that most people, their household income has to be $75,000 or above to buy a home. That is well above the national average income, which also would explain this. But we also see that more and more people are carrying a significant amount of student debt, which potentially slows down home ownership. And I mean, you guys live in New Jersey, so you see that price of $190,000 and you go, I'd love to have a home for $190,000. But remember, this is an average across the entire country. There are a lot of places in the country where houses are and apartments are a lot more reasonable. And another way to look at it is young people are less likely to own a home than ever before. And this is where I start to say things like marriage and having children are linked into other life stages. A lot of times when people got married in the past, it was kind of coupled with buying their first home within months or a year. And you see that as you look at the under 35 group, less and less people are buying homes. And you also see there's a pretty significant dip, particularly in the 35 to 44 crowd, and in the overall U.S. average. And what this is a product of is the fact that things have gotten a lot more expensive. We've talked a lot in the past about the idea that we have more costs now. A lot of like the things like cell phone and internet bills people didn't have before, and that's thousands of dollars a year. In general, things are more expensive than they used to be. And what we're starting to notice is that for adults, this is changing other things as well, because we think that there's a link between buying houses, getting married, having children, and when one starts to decline, it starts to impact the others as well. And to kind of give you something a little more specific, we see here, right? Less people when they turn 30 are living on their own, less are married, less have a child, and less own a home than ever before. So all of this, again, has to do with kind of the changing definition and expectations of adulthood in the United States. So I've shown you this before. I just wanted to bring it up as a refresher. Again, when we look at costs, it's not just homes, right? Cars are significantly more expensive. Minimum wage has not kept pace. College is more expensive. And when getting married and having children and owning a home are all kind of connected to financial stability, which historically they have been, this explains a lot of why a lot of those major life milestones are now being pushed back farther and farther, and people are older and older before they get to them. Now, there's kind of two ways of looking at adulthood beyond just the general age. A lot of sociologists and psychologists have also looked at adulthood for men and women, and these are a little outdated, but they've been kind of the norm for so long that I think it's really important to at least know that this is where we're coming from. And a lot of those stats that I showed you over the last few minutes are what are kind of starting to challenge this. So this is kind of the way we used to think of things, and what I just showed you is how it's starting to get change or evolve. So a sociologist named David Levinson kind of took the stages of adulthood and then modified them to fit specifically American males, and said that American males kind of go through a series of shifts where they have what's called the early adult transition, which is essentially puberty, turning 18. You then have entering the adult world, which is kind of like today what the equivalent of leaving whatever your highest level of education would be. So when you either graduate high school and start working, graduate college, or get out of whatever your degree or training is. And then the two big ones are what are called the age 30 transition, which is kind of like, think of it as like your first life report card. And he noted in his studies of American men that most American men at age 30 kind of look at their life and start to compare it to the kind of cultural norms of society. Are they married? Have they been divorced? Are they going to stay in their career for the rest of their lives? And then the second one, the midlife transition, we know this is the midlife crisis, hence, our guy right down there with his red sports car. But somewhere between 40 and 50, he says that most American men, now that their children, if they have children, are out of the home, now that they are starting to think about things like retirement, they start to now go through the second reevaluation. And psychologically, this is something that has been documented as the midlife crisis. That has kind of been disproven a little bit, but like I said, for a very long time, this was seen as the norm. And what it refers to is the idea that, at least statistically in his research, he found that American men looked at in the 40s and 50s as kind of like a major kind of psychological shift, because now they're on the second half of their lives, and a lot of those other bigger kind of transitions and goals that people had were either achieved already, or the thought was maybe they would never be achieved, hence this kind of idea of some sort of trauma or crisis. Like I said, this has started to be challenged, though, because of kind of the gradual increase in age for a lot of these major life kind of goals, as well as some of the changing cultural standards, right? Like the lower marriage rates. Now, for women, it's the same thing. And again, much like the one I just showed you with Levinson, Irene Fries kind of documents this for women. And this has been starting to kind of fall out of favor as well. But like I said, this is what we kind of looked at as the standard for a very long time. So I wanted to show you where we came from compared to now in terms of our attitudes about this. So what Fries pointed out was that up until very recently in American society, marriage has been the single most dominating kind of life event for American women, whereas Levinson argued that for men, a lot of times it's their career. And as a result, you'll see a lot of the things that Fries said based on her research are focused more on this idea of like family-based shifts. So moving out and getting married, having children, um, temporarily being removed from the workforce, because we know until fairly recently the emphasis on a one-parent income and a stay-at-home mother was very, very strong in the United States. You know, that has changed over the last generation a little bit, but we've talked about this. That is still the norm. If one parent is going to stay home, overwhelmingly it is the mother. And then what Free started to point out, and this is actually what we've started to put a lot more focus on, is this idea of career changes. And in regards to career changes, we see that a lot of it also has to do with when children reach school age. And this is one of the biggest things that's changed in the last generation in like family structure and one income versus two income families. So if we take a look, you see here workforce participation amongst mothers with children age 5 and under has increased nearly 2/3 since 1975. The reason we use 5 and under is that one of the biggest reasons why we see one parent stay at home, which again statistically generally is the mother, for any extended period of time, a lot of it has to do with childcare, both the cost and just the sheer time commitment. So once children reach kindergarten age, we see dramatic increases in workforce participation because, at least in part, during the day, there's a lot more support through the kids being in school. But even here with children under 5, we see that the rate has increased to more than half and a 2/3 increase since 1975 in mothers in the workforce. And this is what I was getting at before when I was saying that a lot of what Levinson and Fries did research on, which had kind of become the standard when we look at gender norms in adulthood, a lot of it is now being challenged because we see that there's much broader workforce participation with women. We see that both men and women are having children or are becoming parents later and are purchasing homes later and are getting married later. And so all of these things have started to lead to kind of a redefining of what adulthood is in the United States. All right, so that about does it for this intro. We'll wrap up here. And the next one that we'll take a look at has to do with that 60+ category. But that'll be for our next video lecture. As always, if you have questions, shoot me an email, and I will talk to you guys soon. All right.